I'm going to be introducing the concept of the passive voice. You'll want to have your book as well as the worksheets from the class web page to look at. So let me start out by explaining basically what the passive voice is. And to do so, I'm going to mention active voice sentences first. An active voice sentence is a sentence that contains a verb, a transitive verb. So for instance, we could use an example, the sentence, "The boy ate the donut." Ate is a verb that takes an object, in this case, the donut. So it's transferring the action from the verb to the object. There is a passive counterpart to that sentence, and that would be, "The donut was eaten by the boy." We use the passive voice primarily to change the focus of a sentence. So instead of focusing on who ate the donut, we focus on what was eaten. Another example, Joe wrecked the car. Now I would ask, to begin with, does the sentence have a transitive verb, a verb that takes an object? And obviously it does, because Joe wrecked something, in this case, the car. So if it has a transitive verb and an object, you can change it into a passive sentence. And I should mention from the beginning that there are reasons why we choose to use the passive voice, and your book will give you more information about that. But a couple of the examples are, we might want to hide who did something, keep that a secret. Maybe we don't want to get someone in trouble or blame somebody for something. So the vase was broken this morning. I've made that into a passive voice sentence because I don't want to say that Joe broke the vase this morning, so I don't want to get Joe in trouble. Or, and we'll have examples of this in a little while, we might be talking about a famous historical event or some kind of famous building or monument, and we may not be really interested in who built or created this place, but we're just focused on the place itself. And then there are other cases in college setting and business settings and so on that we would use the passive voice as well. So for instance, you'll find another document on the website about writing, I believe it is a science report. So you might have a science lab report or a business report that makes use of the passive. So for instance, in a science report you might be outlining the steps that are needed to complete the chemistry lab experiment, or you might be writing a report for a boss about some project that you've done at work, and you may not be focusing again on who did it but on what was done. So what you do not want to do is randomly use the passive voice, because we just don't do that. For instance, you don't want to go into your composition class, your ESLS composition class, or an English comp class, or a history class, and just randomly decide to use the passive voice. That's really not considered good writing, and for a composition or an essay, generally we use the active voice for excuse me, most of the time. So I don't want to hear from your other professors that you've suddenly started using passive voice for everything. All right, so I'm looking at one of the documents that I put online. It's just the introduction and explanation of the passive voice, and I want to explain how you make an active voice sentence into a passive voice sentence. So again, referring back to that original sentence, "The boy ate the donut." We have the subject, the boy, the verb, ate, and then the object, the donut. To make the passive voice sentence, we have to move the parts of this active sentence around. So the subject in the active sentence will become the agent for the passive sentence. We don't always need an agent, so you may or may not have an agent. We'll come back to that in a minute. And then the verb, you need to look carefully at the verb of the active sentence and determine what verb tense it is. In this case, ate is the past tense, so you're going to want to make your passive voice verb also in the past tense. Passive and past are two different things. And then finally, the object of the active sentence will become the subject of the passive voice sentence. So again, in this case, the donut is going to become the subject of the new passive voice sentence. So we'll start out with the donut, and to form the verb for the passive voice sentence, you need to have the verb be plus the past participle of your main verb, which in this case is eat. So what's the past form of be that matches donut? That's going to be was. All right, the donut was. Now we need the past participle of eat, which is eaten. The donut was eaten by the boy. In this case, we will have the agent by the boy because we just want to know who it was who ate the donut. Some cases, again, you won't want to or you won't need the agent. For instance, if you say the mail was delivered this morning, we don't really need to say by the mail carrier because we know who delivers the mail, so it would be a bit redundant. Anytime the agent is an obvious person or thing, then we don't need to include it. So corn is grown in the Midwest is a passive voice sentence. We don't need to say by farmers because we know who grows corn. We know it's not the hairdresser who grows corn, for instance. Okay, so the donut was eaten by the boy. And the other sentence I mentioned earlier, Joe wrecked the car. Joe is the subject, wrecked is the simple past tense verb, and the car is the object. So that would be easy to transform into a passive voice sentence. The car, we need then be in the simple past, was, and then the past participle of wreck is wrecked. The car was wrecked by Joe. All right, so that's a couple of simple examples of the passive voice. One thing I should add right away is that our passive voice verbs can be in any tense. They can be in simple present, present progressive, simple past, past progressive, present perfect, past perfect, which does make it more difficult. It's more complicated when you have to pay attention to the verb tense that you are using. It's very tempting to just use this simple present and the simple past, but that's not the way it works. And let me just stop here for a minute, and then I'll continue. I'm going to continue by looking at a couple of the documents from the class webpage. The first one is labeled 3AB, passive voice Hull House, and then 3ABC is the passive voice Hull House with the answers, but just look at AB, passive voice with Hull House, first. This is a completely made-up example of an imaginary historic home, and it's easy to make a few sentences based on information given about that home in the passive. Because again, a historical house, a monument, we probably really don't care for the most part or most often about who built the house, but we're just focusing on the house itself, and therefore the passive voice is very useful. So if you look at that document, 3AB, at the top, as I've written, the passive voice is used to change the focus of a sentence. Why we want to focus on the building or place foremost. So this imaginary place called Hull House, I have a date, 1789, some other information, local stone and wood, 4 owners or 4 families that have owned the house, the McBrides, the Dewitts, the Archers, and the Brentanos. And also one more bit of information, it says an outstanding example of colonial architecture. So I want to make a few sentences using the passive voice about this imaginary house. So 1789, that's the date of construction for the house. So what are we going to say? Well, we're going to start out with the house. Hull House, we know it's past because 1789 is the past. So we'll choose the appropriate form of the be verb in the past. House is a third person singular, so we need was. And then we need the past participle of build, which is built. So Hull House was built when? In 1789. Hull House was built. Okay, I'm picking up, I had a little bit of a technological glitch. So Hull House was built in 1789. In this case, we really don't need an agent because we don't necessarily care who built Hull House. If we did, we could put in an agent, but we really don't in this case. Now, our second sentence is going to be mentioning the materials that were used in the house. So, again, we'll start out with the subject, Hull House, and we will use the verb build again, or construct, or make, whichever you choose. It really doesn't matter. Let's just say make. So, Hull House was, because again it was built in the past, was made with local stone and wood. Hull House was made, because the past participle of make is made. Hull House was made with local stone and wood. No agent. Don't really need an agent. The third sentence is going to be mentioning the owners of the house. And since the house is still in existence, we're going to want to use the verb tense that refers to something that starts in the past and continues up until now, which would be the present perfect. Hull House has been owned by 4 families. Okay, Hull House has, because it's third person, all right, so Hull House has been, which is for the present perfect, and then the past participle owned by 4 families, the McBrides, the Dewitts, the Archers, and the Brentanos. And finally, our fourth sentence is about the outstanding example of colonial architecture. And this is probably a little bit more difficult of a sentence, but we could say, it is cited, it is cited, C-I-T-E-D, by experts as an outstanding example of colonial architecture. All right? It, pronoun referring to Hull House, is third person singular, and then the past participle of cite is cited. It is cited as an outstanding example of colonial architecture. If you look at the sentences at the bottom of the page, I've given you some active sentences and asked you to remake them as passive voice sentences. So you really should take some time to do that on your own before you listen to me discussing the answers, just to see if you are getting the hang of it. The first one says, in the active voice, an arsonist burned down Hull House in 1922. All right, that's the active voice sentence, and it's in the past. And our verb is the phrasal verb burned down. So we need to take the object of this active voice sentence, Hull House, and make that the new subject. So Hull House, and again we have the past tense, so we're going to need was. Hull House was, and then the past participle burned down in 1922. And it's sort of questionable here whether we need or want an agent or not. Either way is fine. So Hull House was burned down in 1922. Excuse me, was burned down in 1922 by an arsonist. Okay? And of course, as we go along, as I'm doing this lecture and giving these examples, you should be writing down any questions that you have so we can discuss those in class. The second one, Ben Lawrence rebuilt the house the following year. What is our object in this active voice sentence? The house, as it has been in most of these sentences. So the house, again it's the past, was, then we need the past participle of rebuild, rebuilt. The house was rebuilt the following year by Ben Lawrence. If you choose not to mention Ben Lawrence, that's fine. You could just say the house was rebuilt the following year. And we do have flexibility with where the agent goes in the passive voice sentence. So another option is the house was rebuilt by Ben Lawrence the following year, or the house was rebuilt the following year by Ben Lawrence. It really doesn't matter whether the agent comes immediately at the end or a little bit earlier in most cases. The third sentence, the Archer family added a wing